And then now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Madeline Cheney. Madeline is the host and creator of the popular and well-loved podcast, The Rare Life, which was launched in May 2020 after her son Kimball was diagnosed with a rare syndrome. The Rare Life provides support, community, and healing for fellow parents of children with rare conditions throughout the world and has an extremely loyal listener base. I highly recommend giving it a listen. And Madeline has a reputation for her honesty and grace when speaking about sensitive and relevant topics related to having a child with disabilities and medical complexities. So check out her podcast, and Madeline, you're welcome to come up.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Brought my husband here who does IT for work, which is super helpful. There's a lot of stuff with the podcast too. Yeah, it's great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so as she already said, I am the host and creator of the Rare Life podcast, which is also now a nonprofit, which helps us create this free resource and receive the funding we need. And I'm very impressed with everything that Liz has done. It's so cool to hear about the origin of this group. It's incredible. We don't have anything like this for my son's syndrome, so maybe that'll be a project I do when I get tired of this. But so it's a podcast and community for parents of children with rare conditions, and so it's just been really cool to feel a part of the greater community. She talked about the GRIN communities, but for me, I also love to think of like the whole thing, the rare disease community, as part of my people. So the guests on there are mostly other parents in the community because I believe we can gain so much from each other and learn from each other. And it gives us the needed solidarity and community that makes an otherwise very lonely journey a lot harder to go through. And it also is based on the goal of helping us heal. It's been a really cool experience to encourage guests on my show to talk really freely and openly and honestly about the challenges and the joys and our experiences, and then to hear listeners talk about the way that heals, that helps them find healing from their traumatic experiences and the grief that they're experiencing. There's nothing quite like hearing someone talk about something that you're going through or have been through, and to feel understood in that way. And then lastly, also the goal of being able to learn from each other, because again, I think we can learn so much. So we're 4 years in, so we have 9 seasons and 170 episodes, and so there's lots to choose from. We're trying to cover all possible topics that are relevant for you, whether you have a child with CDPX1 like my son, or GRIN2B, or any other rare disease. Okay, so this is my why. I got kind of choked up when she was showing her daughter. Kimball is the little guy with long blonde hair. He's a boy, and his big sister Wendy. Kimball was born with a rare genetic syndrome called CDPX1, and it completely changed our lives for the better, and it was also very difficult. And let's see. So I also found out after we learned his diagnosis that I'm the carrier for his syndrome. And so that will come into play. I'll share a story related to that later. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's really affected our lives as well. And I think it's interesting how these diagnoses feel like they can really put their fingers in like every single possible way of our lives. So Wendy's 8, Kimball's 6, and we live in Utah, so it wasn't too far to come here. It feels actually very similar. And for my work, I run the Rare Life, and my husband Justin's a programmer, which again makes it really nice for tech stuff. Okay, so my topic today, I know it's a little different than what was shared, and I realized this was a better angle to go at. It really is the same thing, but I wanted to talk about the pull that we have as disability parents to control things. And I'll get into kind of what I've learned from my experiences of being Kimball's mom, as well as things that I've learned from other parents as I've interviewed them and been able to talk to them, and then just life experience in general, because I think the desire to control things that we may not have true control over is something that's kind of universal and we can all struggle with in every area of our lives. Okay, so I just wanted to go through this little exercise. So true or false, when we find out our child has disabilities, life feels out of control. And I from every parent I've talked to, that's true. And I think it's something that we know that disabilities happen, and we know technically that they can happen to us and our family and our child, but I think it's something that we never think will happen to us personally. And obviously everyone in this room, at least all the parents, we've been reminded that that's not true. Hard things can happen to everyone. And that it changes everything in our lives. It really can flip your whole world upside down. I think it's interesting too when I talk to parents and they share their stories, there's always a before and after, and that's usually where we start the episodes that are more focused on the story of their diagnosis, where this was my life before, and then this is the moment that we found out, and everything was different after that point, because it really does change so much. So then true or false, when life feels out of control, we try to reclaim control. I think that's true. And then when we try to reclaim control, sometimes we try to control things we don't actually have control over. And I think that's true for everyone, but I do think that when you have a child with a disability, that can be something that we tend to do more than other people. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that our children rely on us in a way that non-disabled children don't. That's something that was really apparent to me since I did have a non-disabled child first, and then the ways that the pressures that were put upon me to help my son progress and survive and just to live was just so different than it was for my daughter who came first. And so I think that pressure that we have on us, it does tend to make us want to, we feel like we need to control everything, and so we try to control everything when maybe some things are not completely in our control. And I think that comes from internal pressure because we want to help our children progress, and we obviously want their success. And I think it also can come externally from therapists or doctors or just society as a whole. And not with malicious intent, but I just think that it happens. One example of this is a mom that I interviewed named Brianna, and she had a son. Her first son was disabled, and then she had her second son who was non-disabled, and she was telling me about how that experience was so eye-opening for her because she did so many therapies, and she still does, so many therapies for her first son, Isaac, and so many doctor's appointments and so many interventions to help him just do basic things that everyone else just does. And then when she had her second son, she was like, he's just doing it. I don't have to do anything. Or very little at least compared to that. And she was like, I felt so pressured by therapists. I felt in some ways, sometimes inadvertently shamed for not doing the exercises enough and not helping him progress. And well, he's plateaued. What are you doing wrong? Or what am I, she was doing that internally and externally. And so it was very eye-opening for her to recognize the amount of pressure that was put upon her in contrast to her non-disabled child. And then true or false, life is harder when we try to control things we don't actually have control over. And again, I think that just creates a lot of burden on us as the parents if we feel like we need to just control everything and help our children survive and thrive. Obviously we can influence that we want to, but just the illusion that we have complete control over that can make it a way harder burden on us. And then I think it also leads to burnout a lot faster when we do feel this crushing pressure on us to fix everything and make it better. And I think it can make it so we lose sight of what matters most and that connection with our child as a parent-to-child relationship. And then, on the other side of this, life is better when we release illusions of control and instead focus our energy on things we can control. And to me, that is just recognizing our job as parents, and that is to love them and support them and do what we can and what feels right for us to be in that role, and to resist the urge to feel like it's our job to fix them. And obviously there's a lot, this is kind of a gray area, and it's kind of complex and complicated, and we obviously want to help our children thrive and be their best versions of themselves. But I think keeping it within the context of our job as parents, first and foremost, to support and love them can be really centering and help us with that. Again, I've struggled with this a ton, so this is a good reminder for me too. Okay, so this was a video that I found on social media, and it was with like the heading of like, this is what happens when we try to control things that we actually can't, and I thought it was kind of funny. So, shows this guy trying to mop up the whole ocean. And he's doing it with zeal, and he's trying so hard, and you look at him, he's so proud of his efforts, but obviously we can see like that's not the best use of his energy. So while we're talking today, I just want us to consider, what oceans am I trying to mop up, the proverbial oceans? What puddles can I work on mopping up instead that we have a much better chance at mopping up? And what can I do with these oceans instead of trying to mop them up? Okay, so I had a little activity planned, and it includes needing paper and pens or your phone if that's what you prefer to use, or a computer. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes to allow you to make a list of statements about your child's diagnosis and disabilities and every way that it affects you, your family, or your child. And so ideas with this would be aspects that they're living with right now, aspects that might come up in the future, aspects that you fear, including maybe illogical fears, impacts on your relationships with your partner, other children, siblings, best friends in society, etc. Impacts on your health, both mental, emotional, and physical, and how you have felt about it. So I'm gonna give you like 60 seconds just to brain dump, like do it as quickly as you can without thinking too much about it. Don't overthink things, and just jot down all the ways you can think that it impacts you. Okay, so obviously you probably could write more than that. At least I could if I were doing this activity. But go ahead and stop right there, and you can do more later if you want to continue this. But now, oh, here's my dump without overthinking. Okay, so now make some kind of mark. If it's on your phone, obviously this won't work as well, but if you want to like highlight it a certain color, just take another 30 seconds to star the things that you can control, circle the things that you cannot control, and maybe a question mark if you're like, I don't know, this is kind of a gray area, I'm not really sure if I control this or I can't. So go ahead and do this for another like 30 seconds. Okay, so again, I'm sorry, I wish we had like tons of time for you to be able to take a little more time to do this, but hopefully it at least got you thinking about this and evaluating this, because I think a lot of times we are acting as if we have control over something that we may not truly have control over, and maybe don't recognize the things that we really do have control over, and it can be helpful to kind of sit with that and be conscious about it instead of letting that remain unconscious to us. Okay, so I just wanted to go through two examples of what may have been on a list. And I'm not saying it was on your list, but if it was, just so that it can help us, like you can think about the other things on your list too as we're talking if this is not super relevant to you. And so the first example is the ambulatory status of a child, which in other words, whether they walk or not. So the scenario here would be my child cannot walk and I want my child to walk, which I know is a pretty common thing within the disability community as a whole. Okay, so true or false? If I try hard enough and do enough, then she will walk. If I don't do these things, then she will not walk. And so I just want you to kind of sit with this for a second and kind of evaluate, like, what do you believe about this? Do you think that's true or do you think that's not true? Which I've been told things exactly like this from our child's therapist at different times. Like the pressure was so immense, like if you don't do these things, he will never walk. And so I think it's important to think about it, like, is that true? And I think we can recognize that this isn't necessarily true, but we may subconsciously believe it or have someone tell it to us, and so we believe that. And I think it might be true, and I think it just depends on our child. It depends on a lot of factors, including things that we cannot control, and that might be if they are physically able to ever be able to walk. And a lot of parents, I think, go into this not really knowing. And so it's like, well, maybe they'll be able to walk, and we'll try this therapy, and we'll try that therapy, and we'll do the therapy with them all the time, and we'll work so hard without really knowing for sure what that will bring. And so I think recognizing that, I'm not trying to say we should help our children to walk or we shouldn't, I'm not like trying to have a stance on that, but just as an example of like we need to recognize how much control we truly have over stuff like this. And so do I truly have control over whether my child eventually walks? And I would say no, because I don't think that's true control. Can I influence whether my child eventually walks? Maybe, probably, maybe, if depending on those factors that we can't necessarily control. And so I think recognizing the difference between influence and control is really important. And so going back to my carrier status with my son's syndrome, I've learned this through a lot of fertility issues that we've had because of that. And so I had the belief that if I just got pregnant enough times, then I'd be able to have a child. And that was kind of what the doctors told us too, because they were like, well, it's a 1 in 4 chance of your child having symptoms. And so we were doing that. We were trying to have a baby, so I was getting pregnant, and I kept losing it and losing it and losing it. And so I had to come to terms like, do I truly have control over this? Do I have control over having another child? Because I thought I did. Like statistically, I should, from what they know about the genetics. But do I truly have control over this? And I don't, is what I had to conclude. And I had to ask myself, like, can I influence whether I have this 3rd child? Like, maybe I can do enough to have that happen. If I just got pregnant like 30 times, like maybe one of those would work, but maybe not. And so recognizing that, we also looked into doing IVF to prevent that gene being passed to see if that would work. So we were doing the first steps of that, and I came to realize, like, even if I do IVF and I could do it for 10 years, I still can't control whether or not my body would take that. Like, I don't know. We don't know everything. And so recognizing that I could influence it but not necessarily control it helped to me make the decision, I think we're done. I think we're going to embrace the 2 children that we have, and I'm just actually going to release this completely. And I'm not saying that that is always the decision that we come to with different things regarding our children or other things in our lives, but I do think it's important just the distinction between realizing, do I truly have control over this, or am I just having some amount of influence that may or may not come to what I want? And so I think like when we're deciding whether or not we want to have put forth our efforts and try to influence something like this, we do need to look at the cost-benefit analysis, which I had to do in my case as well with our fertility issues. The first thing, I think it's important for us to examine our why, to see like how much does this matter to me? Why do I want this so bad? Some common whys with the ambulatory example might be for greater independence, for greater convenience, and for the experience of being able to walk, which I think are all very valid reasons. And so we need to go deeper than that and be like, well, why do I want these things? And it might be, I want my child to be able to walk so they can be happy. Or I want my child to be able to walk so I can be happy. Or I want my child to be able to walk so we can have a good life. And I think with these reasons, which I think are very common, and I think they're grounded in a lot of love for our child and wanting to have a really good life with them, I do think we need to look at that and question whether or not we believe the inverse of these as well. If we believe, if my child cannot walk, they will not be happy. If my child cannot walk, I won't be happy. If my child cannot walk, we will not have a good life. And obviously when we hear those, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't think I believe that, I don't want to believe that. But I do think sometimes we do believe that subconsciously. And in my case with the fertility issues, I was looking at my why. Is this really worth it? All the things that we're going through, all the trauma that I'm going through and my family's going through for this. And my why behind it, I realized was like, I want to be whole, and I want my family to be whole because I really want this other child. And so I had to look at that and think, do I truly think that my family cannot be happy or whole, and I can't be happy or whole without this other child? And I think I did believe that. And so I've been working through with my therapist and coming to the realization of like, I can be whole and happy without this other child. I did that. Okay, there we go. So I think the question here is, what can I control? I think we can work towards some neutrality, exposing ourselves to families. So going back to the ambulatory life or ambulatory example, exposing yourselves to families living a full life with a non-ambulatory child and non-ambulatory adults, I think can be really powerful. Just recognizing that those other statements we made before aren't necessarily true. And I think like it's important too to realize too that we might want to work towards neutrality, but that doesn't mean you need to be really happy about it. It doesn't mean you need to you can't ever be sad about it. I've been working towards neutrality with our fertility issues, and sometimes I'm like, yeah, this is super great. I love having 2 kids. It's really convenient. Other times I'm really upset about it, and I think that's totally fine and natural. And then with adaptations, I think that's another way that we can look at what we can control with the ambulatory example. We can find solutions and get creative to do things that maybe we thought we couldn't do with a non-walking child and find out what's important to us. There are so many cool things that families have done with this. And then I think working towards supporting our children and reaching their full potential, which again, we don't necessarily know at the beginning. So I think that's a little tricky. We may be supporting them to eventually walk, or maybe it'll be helping them get fitted for their first ever wheelchair, or helping them learn how to assist in wheelchair transfers. So I think looking at like the spectrum of what independence looks like and what it might look like for our family can also help us. That can be something we can control. Okay, so the other example here I want to go through is grief. And so maybe you wrote on your list, I'm sad, or I don't like that this is what our child has to go through, or what our family has to go through. So I'm really upset that our life and my child's life looks so different than I anticipated being. And I'll say all of these statements I've felt before. I don't want to be upset anymore. I'm an awful person for being so unglued. I need to be strong and get over it. If I just look on the bright side enough, I can eliminate this grief and then everything will be better. So those might be beliefs that we have. So do we have control over our grief? Grief is a systemic response to loss. It's not an emotion and it's not a choice. And I think that's like super, my mind was blown when I learned about this from a grief expert named Colin Perry. And I think that is so telling for us, and it's really important for us to recognize that we don't choose to grieve. This isn't something we're like, yeah, now I'm gonna feel super sad about this because I don't love my child or because I'm not happy. A lot of the times this is a very complex type of grief. And because our child may be right there with us, but we're grieving the life that we had previously and that we anticipated having with our child and the life that we wanted for our child. And I think knowing that our body is literally responding to that loss is very freeing because we don't need to take responsibility for it and think that we're bad for that. Another aspect we need to remember is that grief is non-linear and that it ebbs and flows, and there can be different triggers for that, different things that may come up, like maybe seeing other kids play soccer could bring up the grief of a child being non-walking and be like, well, I wish my child had that. I wish I could have the experience of watching them do that. Or it may be things that are less expected, like being at a conference like this and being around so many other parents that understand and being empowered and feeling so much joy. We may also unexpectedly feel a stab of grief because it's a reminder of that. And I think it's important to recognize that it may be logical at times, and sometimes it may catch you off guard and make you surprised by it. And then in her work, Colin Perry talks about the ways that grief manifests systemically. And I'm just gonna go over this really briefly, but there are 6 ways that she talks about. The first is emotionally, and I think that's what we most often think of when we think of grief. I'm like, I feel grief right now. And so that might be sadness, it may be anger, it may be jealousy or overwhelm. Another one is physically, and so this one's really interesting because I've talked to a lot of parents who have had physical issues with their bodies, especially during the time of diagnosis or high stress. And that can be a grief response or feeling like really tired even though you're getting enough sleep. That's one that I definitely succumb to. I struggle with that one a lot. And really quick too, I want to mention that you may experience 1 or 2 of these, you may experience all of them. It can be sometimes and other times different. But I think it's interesting to keep these in mind and be like, okay, that's grief showing up. That's not me just being crazy, I'm not sure what's going on. And then cognitively is the third one. And so that one actually has a term, it's called grief fog. And so that refers to being just like, oh, I'm losing my keys all the time. I can't remember things I'm usually really good at remembering. Another one can be spiritually, and this is another one that I've heard a lot of parents talk about, and that can be things like I've had this long-held religious belief, and suddenly I feel so angry towards God. Why is he doing this to me? Why is he doing this to my child? And then socially, and this one might be I usually like to be with people and suddenly I just want to be alone. I don't want to be around anyone. Or it can be I can't stand to be alone and I need to be with other people. And then lastly, behaviorally, and that's basically anytime someone's like, well, you're just not acting like yourself, or you recognize that in yourself. Like, I'm just not myself and I want that back. That can be grief showing up in your life. Okay, so what can we influence regarding grief? If we agree that it's systemic, it's a response, we can't necessarily choose whether or not we're experiencing that or not, what can we do to influence that? The number one thing for me is to not moralize it, and I think, again, recognizing that we don't choose it can help with this, but recognizing that grief isn't bad, it doesn't make you a bad parent, it doesn't mean that you don't love your child immensely, it doesn't mean they don't bring you great joy, that those things can coexist, and you're just not a bad person for that one. And then secondly is to accept it when it shows up. And I think giving it space, and if you think of it as a body of water, if it remains still and it just sits there, it can become stagnant. And that's how you think when we usually get stuck in that grief. And I've experienced that a lot where I was like, no, I don't want to feel grief. I don't like this. I don't want it. I should be happy, I should be grateful for all these things. That's when it really made problems in my life because it will show up. Whether or not you choose to allow it, it will be there in different ways. And so if you imagine the difference between a pool of water that's very stagnant versus a flowing stream, which if you allow it space and you allow it to move and do what it needs to do, it'll remain healthy and you won't get stuck in that. And so one way to keep grief moving is to ask, what does my grief need right now? And I think sometimes the answer may be surprising, but it can be a lot of different things. And let me, sorry. It's gonna go back here. Okay, sorry, I just wanted to read off some examples that I have for ways that we can help it keep moving. So a few examples of this would be journaling, doing therapy, which I have benefited so much from my therapist, a conversation with a trusted friend, a good cry, snuggles with my child, creating art, a hard workout. I think it can be a million different things, but I think being really cognizant of that and asking yourself that one simple question of like, what does my grief need right now? And trying to give yourself space to do that can be very, very helpful. And I think sometimes it's also like, we're not going to therapy today. We're gonna skip therapy and we're gonna stay home and watch movies with my child. I think things like that are totally, like if you recognize what's happening, I think it can give you permission to do those things that you need to do. Okay, so the last part of the list activity, let's see, let's put that up there. Okay, so I want you to go back to that list that you made at the beginning and make any changes that you may feel you need to make. So if you're like, okay, well, I put on there I can control that, but maybe I can't truly control that. Or you may even add things like, okay, if I put on there that I'm really upset about my father-in-law because he keeps making these insensitive comments, you can put on there, okay, well, maybe I can't really control him making those comments, but what can I do? And you can even add something. So it might be like, I'm going to try to have a heart-to-heart with him and see if that does anything. But I think recognizing like I can try to influence it, but at the end of the day, I can't truly control that. So I'm going to give you a minute to go ahead and revisit that list. Oh, here's our good part. Okay, so you can continue to kind of think about that question too and just let it simmer and do whatever you want to do with that. But in conclusion, I just want to reiterate how much of an impact it can make on our lives when we recognize the things that we can't truly control, when we can conscientiously make decisions of what actions you can take to influence things or to control things that are more in your power, and to be able to work on releasing anything in your life that you feel that white knuckling grip on, and come to that acceptance. Okay, so this is the way we can connect. So I'm on Instagram a lot more than like Facebook, under the _rare_life. If you want to pop in my DMs, I love talking to parents and messaging about things like this. And then the website, therarelife.org, and if you just search The Rare Life on any podcasting apps or on the website, it will come up. So I hope that we can connect there. Thank you so much. This is such an honor.